Like, what can we actually do this week, next month to make a difference and to push forward this movement of trying to really create value and actionable, improvements in life through AI and the conversation and decision intelligence. So would you like, who's going to start? You want to? Okay, you are welcome to start.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reflecting on the whole day and like, what should we do next year or next week? One thought that I had, and I think we can kind of miss that, and I take it as a clear action going forward. We are talking about what should the future look like and how all of us can contribute to the future, and the future is missing in the room. Right? I mean, I'm like, where are the 25-year-olds, right? I mean, we are all deciding what a future should be looking for. Yes, one or two here, right?
Three, right?
But this is something
no pressure,
that
guys.
me and Lorraine spoke about. We are kind of, on behalf of the future, deciding what it should look like, and we should have more.
Three. We got three.
Three of them. We should have more of them.
You qualify.
Yeah. So what I was thinking, Lorraine, if you kind of agree, next year we will do it at the SAP Academy for Engineering, because then you will have 150 25-year-olds who are the engineering students, and they could be part of this, because I want them to listen to this, and they may actually say, you guys are getting it wrong. We want a different future. I don't know, a better future, but maybe fundamentally different. But what's important is to have them as much involved as we think we are.
Yeah.
I remember this because I once was invited to a panel on diversity and inclusion, and their focus was on disability, and there was nobody disabled in the panel, and neither in the whole room. So I'm like, okay, so we guys are talking about somebody, and they're not even in the room, right? And
at least they cared about
it. I think that's one thing that I'm thinking aloud right now, to invite a different age group so that they are included in the solution as well. Just a thought.
Yeah, we can all bring somebody with us, like you did with your son, and it's a wonderful thought. Lorian?
I guess I want to be audacious, and I want to see if I can pull together all the threads in 5 sentences. Let's see if I can pull this off. Let's use Alex's crowd of angels. Let's use science fiction and narrative to make those angels effective and understandable and compelling. Let's include that in an interactive game that has visual elements per Josh. Let's use the government to help to build that so that we get funding so that we can do it, and Josh can help to enable that, right? And then let's have, this is crazy, I know, but I can just put it out there as a stake. And then let's have those agents, what are they trying to accomplish is to improve understanding of complex systems reasoning so that we can rebuild democracy through an informed populace. I think Dick Tocqueville said that. Right?
Beautiful, yeah. Very well.
I don't know if that was all the threads, but it's my attempt.
All right, so that's no small feat right there. But let's start here with a couple thoughts and maybe some ways to implement that. Part of it.
I guess I would touch on what actually surprised me about today was today could have been as much of one of the conferences on complexity. I spent a lot of time in the field of complex systems theory, attending a lot of events related to complex systems theory. And to me, the discussion today was really about complexity, much more than I thought it would be when I was coming up here. I thought maybe my talk would be a little bit of an outlier. And in fact, I don't think it was whatsoever. I think most of the conversation was really about dealing with complexity and uncertainty and emergence, and in particularly unintended consequences, right? Second, third, fourth order effects, things we're usually not good at thinking about in advance. In fact, one of the things that really struck me was, and I understand why, but in some ways maybe it's because I come from the intelligence community, but there was hardly any discussion at all about intentional use of AI for negative purposes.
Yeah.
And I realized we're all in the place of thinking about it in positives because we're talking about responsible AI, but there are places in the world where AI is being developed and being used actually quite effectively with from our perspective, would be extraordinarily negative consequences.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really a part of the discussion.
We're
So
optimists,
maybe that's,
eternal
and
optimists.
we are,
Right?
and I think it's great.
Yeah, but unintended consequences. Yeah, right.
But usually, or at least often, you hear more of that, right? And less focus on unintended consequences. So in some ways, I thought this audience was actually surprisingly enlightened, and it actually made me feel really good that you're comfortable talking about unintended consequences and second and third, fourth order effects.
Yeah.
Whereas,
We probably don't know people who intentionally use it, and they may not even come to the panel if we.
Yeah, exactly. Not allowed.
anyway, this notion about
Thank
complexity.
you. Yeah, the complexity is interesting. So one of my favorite quotes is Leonardo da Vinci's quote, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right? It takes a lot of complexity to understand and come up with solutions that seem and sound simple but really aren't. So can you guys speak a little bit about that? Tell me a little bit about the complexity you face and how you could come out with some sort of simple ways to move us forward.
Sure. So that specifically, that desire to try to find a specific targeted trajectory was what drove my thinking with the talk that I gave. In any complex system, and it's always a set of feedback loops, and in any sort of set of feedbacks, there are going to be places in the feedbacks where there's more stuff going through. There are going to be, the distribution of degrees of the nodes in that network is not going to be the same. All those loops aren't created equal, and what that means is that you can find places in that network of feedbacks where small changes can affect large consequences. So the trick is to be able to figure out, what are those hubs in that network, and what are those points? What are the people? Who are the people who are situated, on those hub nodes, or who can influence those hubs, and what validation system do they run on? What motivators do they respond to? So I believe that what decision intelligence can bring and what it can help us with, the process of mapping out those feedbacks, the process of thinking in aggregate about these connected problems, and then the process of identifying those places where we can make a specific difference is going to be key. And it starts with community. It starts with all of us connecting with as many of each other as we can. It starts with all of us being as engaged with each other and starting to just have the conversation pairwise to think about actions that we can individually take, and then reflecting that content back into the greater community, but always with that eye towards what are the specific points. The Digital Angels idea I picked up on was because leaders in technology can make a difference, and if we can reach them, that's one place where we can affect a specific change. There may well be others, but I think that if all of us using our brains together are able to map that problem, we'll be able to find those bright points, and when we can find those bright points, we can act on affecting change.
And that's actually dovetails very well into what Neil does, because you're talking about, you're discussing sort of from the ground up, and Neil, his business in his talk is sort of like going to the big corporation and, sorry, apologize, Reed, I'm so sorry.
Whatever you want, doesn't matter.
Sorry, thank you, Lauren.
What's in a name?
Yeah, it's like, I had Neil before. Reed, I apologize.
Doesn't matter.
But your talk, I obviously listened and remembered what you were saying, and the reason is because it was about taking it from the opposite side and impacting change from a corporate level, and finding the sensitivity points within a large corporation that would drive change firm-wide. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, right. So I think that when people are pushing for change, both when it's in corporations and with government, you need to be talking about concrete policies or procedures or practices or structures. So to give you some kind of analogy, there's a political theorist named Adolf Reed who does amazing work. And one of his big, well, to my mind, one of his big ideas is something like, look, people, when they were fighting in the civil rights movement, they weren't fighting against racism. Right? A lot of times people today are saying, we're against racism. They were fighting for desegregation. Right? It was a very specific thing that they wanted implemented. They want the right to vote. Very specific policy, very specific processes that they want in place, not vaguely anti-racist, because that doesn't move the needle. You need to fight for something specific. And that's true whether you're pushing for governmental change or you're pushing for corporate change. So one thing that I'd like to see more of when people talk about things like responsible AI, doing good, et cetera, is No. What are the exact things that you want done? Is it a thing that we need to get people to vote on? What do you want them to vote for? What's the thing we're saying yay or nay on? Because just saying we're for change, we're for good, we're against bad things, that doesn't move the needle.
That's right, Reid. That's a really good point. Lorianne, what is that point? What do you want to be said? What do we want? Tell us what we want.
Better understanding and a movement from an obsession with data that's been driven by, I'm sorry to say, a lot of vendors who make a lot of money off of selling us data appliances, right? And a movement towards an understanding that data is great, but unless it's connected to some problem that it can solve, and that we start with the outcome we're trying to achieve and work backwards, as opposed to starting with the data, which is like looking under the lamppost. And this realization that when we work backwards from the problem, often the elements of the solution, the puzzle pieces, yeah, data might be in there, but there's a huge amount of human insight, somatic intelligence, emotions, empathy, heart, soul, gut, and that we've been systematically overlooking these other critical ingredients for the hardest problems because we're a little bit addicted with data. It's time to get past that.
So my personal take, and I completely agree with what you said, again, if you look at social movements, very clear. This is the problem that I'm going to solve. This is a simple statement. That's when you can rally millions of people to solve it, right? But the interesting aspect is that that level of clarity arrives over a period of time. And what I believe is that when a lot of people come together over and over again, you kind of crystallize, the group crystallizes the exact solution. Because today, you ask 10 people, there are 10 different ways to solve the same problem, or 10 different definitions of the problem itself, right? I mean, in this room, everybody understands the impact of AI and DI very differently in so many different ways. But if you do this often, you as a group can come to exactly what's the problem you want to solve, and then you can probably come to the solution as well. And I think that is a process by itself, right? It's very hard for one person to come and say, I know what the problem is, and this is the way forward, so let's join. I think it's a process which requires some level of iterations.
So if I could just add to that, I mean, I've been trying to evangelize this whole DI thing since about 10 years ago when I did this big survey and I realized there was this gap between the data and the actions. And it's been kind of lonely, right? I've been trying to sell DI things, and nobody has a budget for DI. They have budget for machine learning, so I'm selling machine learning. And it's been, a really uphill struggle. And thanks to Feroz and some others who really encouraged me to get this book out, well, the book's out, okay? So what happens next? Who are you guys who are the ones who decided not to leave at the end of the day? And this is where I don't understand what happens next. How do we move beyond me just kind of banging this drum the way I have, and in the last few years, Feroz supporting that, to something that's much more broad-based, where you guys contribute to this, and I'm not like, Griffin can attest to this. He grew up with me doing this like every single day. It was my son over there. He's a pain in the neck, right? And now he works for a DI company, which is so cool, right? But it's time to invite a larger audience, and that's where I struggle. Maybe the book will make that happen, but I really need you guys' input. I mean, I can't do this.
Yeah.
We can't do this alone anymore.
We have a comment here. I was just going to go ahead.
It's okay.
No, go right ahead.
I actually wanted to just double down on what Reid was just saying, because if you don't have a sort of a concrete, firm what it is you want to achieve, you're going to wallow in this world and just, you're going to go it's going to be a mess. And the classic example of that is what happened in the so-called war on terror, right? Where we got into this debate about what are our actual objectives, and we started to have a discussion in Washington about, our objectives were freedom, right? Well, what does that look like in terms of how do you put that into some kind of an actual policy agenda? And I think this is really the tale of American strategic emphasis and effort in the wake of the Second World War. Ever since then, we in many ways have had a tough time sort of, when it comes to the use of military force, for instance, being able to say what it is we're actually trying to accomplish, right? Which is one of the reasons why we haven't accomplished a lot with the use of military force, right? And if you look at any of the real wars that we fought since the Second World War, you could argue that they weren't particularly successful, right? Because you don't know if you don't know what you're trying to get, you're not going to get anything, right? We didn't know what we wanted in Korea, and it ended up in a mess. Same thing in Vietnam. You could argue the same thing with the war on terror. So it's really important when it comes to strategy, and I don't care if it's military strategy or what kind of strategy, is you have to know what your objective is.
Yeah,
And
your
it has
end
to be
game.
and it has to be attainable.
Yeah.
And if it's not, you're lost.
Yeah,
I agree, 100%.
I'll just talk. I spent a lot of time with Professor Hagi Rao, who's probably the top social movements professor at Stanford, and he said something brilliant. He said, the thing that is common about successful social movements is that it either had a common enemy or a collective pride. Yes. That's the only thing that matters. You either have a common enemy or you need to have a collective pride. So when Gandhi started his movement, the enemy was the British. Very simple. Get them out of the country. When 1 million people walked, women walked, the enemy was Donald Trump. Very simple. So it was very clear that either you have a common enemy or you work for something which is a collective pride. And I think we need to figure that out. I mean, I'm not saying we need to figure out an enemy here, but at least if it's for pride, then that's what we need to figure it out. And he says, that's the only way social movements are ever going to be successful, otherwise it's not going to work.
Yeah, and decision intelligence, using data to inform decision intelligence is the means by which you get to those endpoints. But I think the idea is you have to have those endpoints. Is it poverty? Is it this? What is it specifically that you're trying to affect the change, and then using the data and the decision making to come to the right solution for that.
It's the only way you'll know you got there.
That's right. Well, that's right. There's measurable milestones and goals.
Although one thing that I will chime in on just to sort of say is that I think reason itself can be a goal if it is articulated and it is framed in the right way and is framed in pragmatic, specific terms. One thing that we are losing right now, the core of the coordination problem that we are facing, is that the amount of rationality in the dialogue is going down. And we are not going to be able to affect meaningful global solutions if that process continues. So we can mandate and require, we can articulate to some extent what we are against. And that is kind of like radicalization and tribalization, knee-jerk reactions, spontaneous sort of like people getting really angry and then sort of retweeting an article before they've actually read it. We're all to some extent all of us have engaged a little bit in this behavior, and it's incredibly easy and it's incredibly seductive. But there will be no good outcome unless we make reason one of the goals. It doesn't have to be the only one, but it can be a goal in its own right.
And you said how to articulate reason is important. How do you articulate it?
Then
no pressure.
At some level, Laurian's, she's got the book in her hand. The point in decision intelligence is key. Is of like reason. The longer, like every human action, people are looking to fulfill some goal state in their head. Their dopamine neuron system is active. There's some state they're looking to achieve, and there's some number of neurons that are sort of clicking them along towards, getting some result from some particular state. A huge amount of what we've done over the last century is increase convenience and make those dopamine neuron chains shorter, make it easier for people to get to the things that they just want right now. The problem is we're now getting to the point where that's defeating us. So putting extra steps in those chains, asking people, if they imagine that they want this thing, ask them why. Asking them, if people are trying to affect some specific change, ask them how. Chains of why and chains of how. Stuff which Laurian has covered extensively in her writing. These are the kinds of things that we need to take, these easily memorable concepts that can be shared with the public and bolt them into the dialogue and encourage people to feel proud of thinking about more than one thing at a time.
So think 24 hours before you send the email. Laurian, go ahead.
So I have really good news for you guys, which is there's a really simple way to solve this, and it just involves overcoming one bad habit. and over about a dozen consulting engagements over the past 10 years. Chapter 4, page 104 is all about this, but I'll give you the thumbnail summary. Start with the outcomes. Don't allow people to talk about their data or their actions or their ideas. I mean, you might want to be respectful, and you need to let people speak and establish their credibility, but gently steer people towards the outcomes. Every single one of the dozen or so consulting engagements I have done in this space, I get into the room, and everybody's saying we should do X, and we should do Y, and we should do Z, but nobody is in agreement as to why, as to what their outcome is. And if I start to talk about the outcome, if there's 6 people in the room, I will hear 6 different answers, 6 different goals that they're trying to achieve. No wonder that their actions are different, because they have different goals. And so my 5-minute introduction to DI, if you don't want to read the book, brainstorm your outcomes, stay focused on those, no ideas are bad, be funny, be improvisational, and get all of those really crazy outcome ideas down on paper. Step 1. Step 2, get your really crazy action ideas down on paper. Keep data out of the room. Keep paths of cause and effect out of the room. If you only do those 2 steps, and you get your team aligned around at least their verbal description of their outcomes, forget about the rest of DI. You've got 80% of your value right there, and nobody does this. So there's a huge opportunity. To me, that's my leverage point.
And it seems like that's what everyone on the panel is echoing. I'm hearing a lot about goals, easily articulated goals, something that everybody understands, get everybody on the same page, everybody wants this outcome, and then figure out how to get there or how best to get there in the process behind it. That's right, yeah. Draw pictures, as Lorianne said, yes. You wanted to say something?
No, I'm just nodding in
okay, very
complete
good.
assent.
We had a question way in the back. Can I?
Can you hear Marco?
Yes, we can hear you. I can repeat it. If you,
I'm Anderson. I am a tech evangelist and renewable energy enthusiast. One of the things I really hear when I see you guys going back and forth, that I really enjoy, by the way, is that if we're looking for ways to center these disparate groups on goals, we're actually in a really good place to do this, because SAP is actually already aligned with the UN SDG goals. What I really find interesting here is that we're not just looking at our own way of life. You know, we're pretty well off. We're good. No one needs to start. Is that they're taking a long-term view of how the rest of the world can at least match what we've reached here, which I think we've reached a pretty good level of sustainability. We can read. Girls can go to school. We have access to broadband. Everyone's drinking clean water in most places. Anyway. So, but I mean, the fact that it's most places means that we ourselves have a challenge. We still have a challenge to reach. So, what I think is interesting is that I'm actually curious, because if we can find ways to find common ground on UN SDG goals, I think we have a very, very large force behind us, because we can say the things that we're looking for are also going to solve these UN goals. Yeah. We're also going to get parity in some places, renewable energy, clean water. Access to school for girls, which we know boosts everybody's GDP. I think what it does is that it gives us some momentum to start with. And so that initial resistance is no longer there. It's more like, oh yeah, obviously I want clean water, and I want fast internet, and I want access to school for people that can't get there, because we already enjoy those things. So I think it's more of a suggestion. I would love to hear your feedback, your pushback, your reservations on that, and then also if you have ways to help me move that forward, I would really appreciate that as well.
I think, just to repeat, I mean, if I have to summarize what you said, why don't you align with the UN SDG goals? Because that's well articulated, and a lot of what we are talking about kind of falls into one of those SDG goals, right? I mean, that's what you meant. Completely agree. But I think there are 17 of them, and I think we wanted to kind of focus on the impact of technology for the larger good, and the larger good falls into all of those 17 categories, right? So we're coming from a technology-first point of view, rather than the other way around, where we are saying these are the problems that we should solve, and what could technology do. So we were more coming from technology-first perspective.
so a goal would be, articulate the goal then out of technology.
Yeah.
Give me the end goal.
Yeah.
Can you articulate that?
Yeah.
Tell me what it is.
I mean, again, very hard to put a goal on right now.
Right.
But again, as I said, if I look at the topics that we covered today from an AI perspective, a big topic was climate change, wealth inequality. Not that we have solutions for all of them, but at least those were the few topics that we touched on. Again, I don't have
The ones where AI can impact. So take a few of the goals that are actionable with AI and data and focus on those.
Yes.
As opposed to
Which fall onto the
abroad.
SDG 17, one of the 17 SDG goals.
Okay.
That's what.
Okay.
And this is where the
we're trying
tension is, because we've agreed that we need to be focused. But we've also agreed that these problems are highly interdependent. So if we focus on just one siloed goal, we'll actually not succeed because we'll hit a whack-a-mole. So to me, this is the essential tension that we're facing. Movements are not successful unless they're focused. But this particular movement needs to be neo-generalistically, interdependently, holistically, that chump thing that I had, where it's one, it's all just the same problem.
Complex.
It's that complex, holistic, unified, multi-link problem, right? Because it's all the same thing. So how can we be focused and interdependent at the same time, Reid and Alex, since I've been talking too much?
So I actually want to, I'm always the pessimist, it seems. The SDGs are great, totally great. We should go for them. It's great. It's not the only answer, though, when you're talking about tech ethics. It's not the only thing. For a couple of reasons. Number one, there's just lots of business applications that have nothing to do with the SDGs. Okay, sorry, two things. Number one, you can pursue morally just ends in morally unjust ways, right? So it's not always the case that the end justifies the means. You can commit great injustices in the name of a great good. And so we could do the same thing with the SDGs. So just saying we're fighting for the SDGs is great, but also how you go about fighting for them matters. The second thing to say is that there are a lot of goals that businesses pursue in creating, deploying AI that have, forget about morally or ethically bad ends, just they're ethically neutral. I don't know, serving up apartments for you to view when you want to move, or maybe job ads. That seems it's ethically neutral. I guess it's somewhat good. But you could pursue an ethically neutral goal in an ethically problematic way. That's the famous problem of unintentional bias built into the systems, so that you're not showing black people certain kinds of apartments, or not showing them certain kinds of job ads, because your software, your AI has bias built into it. So talking about SDGs and really great ethical goals, 100% important. We need social movements built around it. A variety of strategies need to be employed to achieve those goals, but we shouldn't let that blind us to the ways in which we need to think about the means to our goals, whether those goals be morally good or neutral.
So
The means is the goal. The means as the goal.
Yeah, there's a general goal of making sure that you aren't ethically negligent, let alone ethically bad, in your pursuit of the good or the morally neutral.
In other words, if you use a negative mean, there may be unintended consequences. That's, to me, why negative means are bad, is because you may not be aware of, when you do something negative, what kinds of ripple effects that has.
Yeah, I mean, I would slightly push back. So there's a way in which a lot of people in tech think about ethics in just strict consequentialist terms. Not surprising, because consequentialism as a moral theory is about optimizing something. And so, of course, the engineers go for a theory about optimization. There are other moral theories, though, that are less about consequences and more about it's just the wrong thing to do, even if the consequences are good. So we shouldn't think of ethics, I don't think, as there's a unit of thing that we need to maximize, and now let's do the calculus. It's also the case that they're just things we shouldn't do, even if the consequences would be good, because we would be wronging people by virtue of doing it.
So two ends of the panel. Go that end of the panel, then this end.
Okay.
Go ahead.
A couple of things I'd like to say about the reference to the SDGs. First is, I think that there's interesting ways in which a kind of sort of an AI, DI thinking and the SDG goals can operate very nicely together. There's a project which we embarked on at Product Ops, in part because of conversations that we had with Laurian, where we have started looking at scraping academic data about consequences in sort of, like, for instance, ecosystem dynamics. Like, for instance, if there is healthy upstream forests, it improves the outcomes in terms of children's diarrheal illness in settlements downstream in various parts of the world. But you need to have the right kind of upstream forest. So there are these causal associations, and there's brilliant research that's been done. It's currently sitting distributed out into the world. It hasn't been aggregated. It hasn't been mapped. That's something that which we can do straight away, is we can basically try to aggregate and understand that information and pull it together using technical tools which we have right now to build it into a cohesive tool, so we can start building a form of globalized decision intelligence where we can understand all of this research. The other thing I think that is interesting about the SDGs is that they exist and they have been trumpeted. They're a nice bright point that already exists out there in the world. The way in which you align people around large-scale coordinated action is you give them some, as people have talked about, wanting specific things for people to do. People coordinate best when there is a positive outcome for them, when there is something really specific and great that they can aim towards. So I think that we can use something like the SDGs as a visible beacon to start driving attention towards an outcome. If in my perfect world, what I would like to see is something that's a synthesis. That there's a lot of SDG goals. There's like 17 of them or whatever. How about 8 billion happy people in a biosphere that works? That's a sort of a distillation of what I'd like to see, and we can stick that beacon out there and build towards that, and use all of these nice tools that we have in a pragmatic way to actually then map the journey that goes from where we are now to that place. And framing all of it in terms of concrete and specific actions as much as we possibly can.
Thank you.
I just want to point out a point about complex systems, and that is, when dealing with complex systems, you can never only do one thing.
No.
So every time you do something, there are going to be multiple other effects rippling through the system. So even if the action that you take, you have a goal in mind, and you take an action that is highly moral and with all good intent, there's almost guarantee that there will be some influence, some kind of an impact on the system that will not be positive. Okay, it's not just, now the question is does that negative get rippled through the system? Does it get reinforced by feedback loops and built? Or does it get damped out by the system? And this is one of the real challenges in terms of dealing with these kinds of systems, is it's almost impossible to know in advance. So there's a certain amount of experimentation. There's a certain, this is where you get into the road to hell being paved with good intentions, right? We started out doing something that we thought was the right thing to do, and the outcome intended not being. So I'm all for it, right? But we just need to keep in mind, and if things start to seem to be amplifying the negative, we have to be willing to change. So it's dynamic. It's just something to keep in mind. You can never do only one thing. You're not.
You can't always put the procedure in place to find the problems before, because you might not know what problems you're looking for. So you have to be vigilant. Right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So you have to be vigilant so that when something happens, you're on it.
So there is no solution. That means what you're constantly doing is you're just managing.
There is no perfect solution, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot more that we could do. So I have a fantasy that 10 years ago, folks who started social networking companies had a decision intelligence meeting in which they said, let's bring our best diverse minds together into a room, social scientists, behavioral psychologists, technologists, and more, and let's see how well we can map out these secondary, tertiary, long-term effects. I choose to believe that if they had done that, they might have been able to, at least as a hypothesis, to anticipate some of the negative social consequences. And they would have said, as platform creators, our platform will only survive if Amazon, when I bought shoes, if it shipped me a fish, I wouldn't go to Amazon anymore, right? Similarly, if a social platform has this terrible unintended consequence, it's going to lose its leverage. And so I think you're right, Josh, that we can't be perfect. But that doesn't mean we can't have a systematic, agile, constantly updated discipline of constantly trying to map and remap and in a very agile way sense make about these multifaceted, multi-linked consequences. And you have to have that, and they ripple out.
Thank you. We are out of our time, and I want to thank all of our panelists for your contributions. I'm going to let you say a last few words, but